Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. Thank you for joining us for this live broadcast of a Geoscience education talk. The title slide is on the screen right now. Strategies for empowering students in science courses to learn and prepare for exam assessments. And our guest today is Laura Lukes from University of British Columbia. Thank you for the report. We're 5 by 5. Terrific. Let me get on camera. We'll say hi to a few of you. Hi, everybody. So I'll just spend another couple seconds with you all, make sure that I know that we're doing okay, and then I'll get the microphone on our speaker. We'll make sure that it's working for her, and then we'll be off and running. We have a nice crowd enjoying the Vindman's Bakery. The Vindmans today, more scones, there's cookies. This is some sort of white chocolate raspberry creation. Thanks as always to Jeff from Vindman's Bakery for doing this. Looks like we're doing okay, huh? We're 5 by 5. Where are you viewing from today? We've got a couple of minutes before we start. Fabian, Alberta, Springfield, Oregon, Tri-Cities, Washington, Charlotte, North Carolina, Bitterroot Valley, Montana. Hello. Irene from Kennewick. Loud and clear, says Edith. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to swing you around and have you enjoy the room as it continues to fill in. And I'll be asking if you can hear if Laura's microphone when I put that on her in just a little bit. Thank you so much for joining us. Clean up my garbage here. Hi. Hi. Okay, can I put this on you here? Sure. Yeah, maybe like right. If this works okay for you, something like that. We want this to. So does that work for you there, Laura?
That's
okay.
Fine.
Is it too floppy, or does it feel like it's going to work okay?
Yeah, it should be okay.
Okay, good.
I think.
So if you would continue chatting with Ann, now they can hear you at home. Just letting you know, but we want to make sure they can hear you okay.
I'll step away. Okay. Okay. Sounds good.
Well, I'll chat with you and make sure that they can hear you okay. This is kind of an experiment to do. Have you done much with YouTube and
not with.
watched
I
other
haven't
programs?
done live.
Okay.
Before.
Yeah. So viewers, can you hear Rachel as she chats with me? Where did you grow up? Right in Washington, D.C., or one of the suburbs?
Laura and I.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What did I call you?
Rachel.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. on the Virginia side.
Nice. Wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, they can hear you.
Okay,
Look
excellent.
at that. Yeah. So we've got, Laura is standing here with me right now. Where are you viewing from right now? Oh, we've got, Rachel's in the room. That's why I said Rachel. I got my names mixed up looking at all this. Look at this. So 5 by 5 means loud and clear, so they can hear both of us. Laura's rather quiet. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, yeah, I am going to get people to sit down a little closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to be a little quieter, I
Okay.
would say.
We can make it work. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Well, we got 60 now, and we'll have a few more hang in if we like.
Oh, we've got folks from all over.
Yeah, feel free. I'm going to go visit with a couple folks. So Laura's looking at the Etch-a-Sketch right now and checking you all out. Good morning.
Okay, I see
Morning.
people from Portland, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Oh, thanks, Don.
How's it going?
Good.
Good. Good to see you again. Thank you for coming. Hey everybody, I got a couple quick announcements before we start. It's almost noon. If you want to hear today's talk, we have a soft-spoken speaker. I encourage you to fill the front of the room, seriously. Like, I know you're all settled in and everything, and on your way to the front of the room, we still have Vinmans here. Now, come on. We still have Vinmans to enjoy, but please,
There are lots
we don't
of
have a
lovely
mic
seats.
system in the room. I think you know that. Am I going to have to? You know how this works. Yes, yeah.
I like it, thank you.
Yeah.
Come on in.
You want to be a trendsetter? Come on, let's do it. Let's see how powerful you are here, Robin. Oh, look! Oh! It's happening. Hi.
I'm so delighted about my cookie. It made my day.
Good. Thank you. Oh, perfect.
Yay, thank
Front
you.
row. Front row.
They're lovely
Robin is the
seats
Pied
up
Piper.
here. Lovely seats.
Robin is a powerful person. Thank you. Good. Okay, everybody at home, thank you for being with us. We're going to start right now. I'm going to move this camera right around. Laura, are you okay with a little bit of live question and answer towards the end?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Okay, sounds and looks like you're ready to go. So thank you very much. A couple quick announcements, and then we will turn it over to our speaker today. Thank you for being here, number one. Number two, I still encourage you, there's empty seats right in the front row. If you want to make sure, even get up as we start the talk. If you're having a hard time hearing, come on up. Want to make sure that you can hear this very fine talk. How many people are transfer students who are thinking about coming here, and you're here from Yakima or another spot? Could you raise your hand, please? Hey, you guys. Welcome. I hope that you feel comfortable here. We'd like to get a chance to visit with you after this lecture. So there's there's pizza for you guys across the way if you haven't heard that already. But Bree McGinnis and Ann Egger have set up the Transfer Orientation Day, and it's wonderful to have you. We also have some other guests from out of town who are here today, so terrific to have you here as well. So Ann Egger has hosted our speaker today, and before we get to her brief introduction, let me make sure that you know that next Friday we're on again. Friday, April 26th. April 26th, 1 week from today. Carl Loquist in the Geography Department will be giving a talk here. His talk will be 1 CWU Way, Advancing Knowledge of Rock Glaciers, Permafrost, and Other Cold Climate Phenomenon in Washington's Eastern Cascades. Carl's been teaching here for 30 years, and he's retiring at the end of this quarter. So this is a send-off type of a presentation. We'll see how dramatic he feels like he wants to be. But that's next Friday on our schedule. Then we're off for one Friday, and then on May 10th, Deborah Fiorini, who will be here. When is she coming? When is she arriving, Susan? April 30th, Deborah from Italy will be working with Susan, and Deborah will be giving a talk on the high-resolution hyperspectral microphysical and mineralogical analyses of the ADA 270 ice core. from the Italian Alps. So she's going to be here a few weeks, and is she a post? PhD student who will be here for a month. So that'll be a special treat to hear from her. And then finally, Walter has a guest, May 31st, Lucinda Leonard. Head for the Hills, the potential for locally generated tsunami in the Salish Sea. So plenty offered here in this Friday speaker series. Our talk today is by Laura Lukes. Laura grew up in the East Coast, in the Washington, D.C. area. She did schooling at Ohio State, Virginia Tech, Ohio State again, North Carolina State, and she's been at University of British Columbia for 3 years now. And we're very excited to hear her talk, Evidence-Based Strategies for Empowering Students in Geoscience Courses to Learn and Prepare for Exam Assessments. Please help me welcome Laura Lukes.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me.
Perfect, great.
In my classrooms, the large classrooms at UBC that I teach in, I usually have a microphone. So I'm hoping if you can't hear me in the back, please do come on up. Okay, I see a thumbs up. But thank you, and thank you for having me today. And the introduction, are we putting up the, okay. And yeah, so for context here, you can see some of my students taking their final exam. So one of the things we'll be talking about today is thinking about preparing for exam type assessments. But first, just kind of an outline of what I'll be talking about today. First, taking some time to position myself and today's talk. How did I end up in front of you fine people today in terms of my career path? I know we have a lot of students in the audience. So thinking about how does one go from thinking they're going to be a petroleum geologist to what I'm talking about today. So we'll talk about that. And then I'll be sharing some theoretical frameworks and to consider and as we think about teaching and learning ourselves. And then some highlights from some research I've done on self-regulated learning. And we'll talk about what that is. And then unpack some common student questions around exam time and think about strategies that are evidence-based to support students in this effective self-regulated learning, and time for question and answer. So as Nick was saying, I'm currently at the University of British Columbia, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam, as well as other Coast Salish peoples, so the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish. And just by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with that terminology around traditional, ancestral, and unceded? Most people, okay. Okay. So thinking about, there were a couple questions there. So in this context, thinking about traditional, so places that people are using in ceremony, and then ancestral, thinking about over time, over generations. So thinking about, in the case of the Musqueam, since the last ice age in terms of these particular deposits, which as you can see, we're situated on a peninsula of glacial recess, right? So we're looking at a pile of sand left over from the last ice age, and the Musqueam have been there since time immemorial. And then also thinking about unceded, so different than the Yakima lands that we're on now, the lands here that our campus is on at UBC are unceded. So there is no treaty associated with these lands. It is still their land. So for context, how did I end up at UBC if, as Nick said, I'm from the East Coast? And so what brought me there? So for context, when I was an undergraduate student, how many undergraduate students here? Okay. So when I was in your shoes, I was interested in psychology and geology. And I was like, ooh, I don't know what to major in. What should I do? Then I took an intro geology course, Earth history, blew my mind. And I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. But I was still interested in this psychology piece over here. And so I went on, became a geology major. I worked at the Ohio Department Geological Survey, Natural Resources and Geological Survey. So I did work with drill well logs. My undergraduate thesis was focused on shallow earthquakes in the Ohio region. So small earthquake, the Alliance earthquake. And then from there, I went to Virginia Tech. Again, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to be a petroleum geologist. And I was looking at transpression across the San Andreas Fault system. And so I was really excited about that. But then I was a TA as a graduate student. How many graduate students here? Okay, so as a TA, so teaching assistant, I got really into that, and to the point where I was coordinating the other TAs, I was developing course curriculum. I was spending way more time on that than my transpression research. And I thought, maybe I need to rethink my priorities. So at that point, I pivoted into thinking about pursuing more geoscience education research. And so at that point, I kind of switched and then decided that, well, I need to learn more about education and psychology. So I went back to Ohio State and got a master's degree in education. And so I'm pretty well founded in terms of learning theory, pedagogy, and the practice of teaching. And then from that, I taught high school and community college out in Arizona for 5 years. And so, but again, it was kind of creeping in where then I started doing workshops for other teachers and teaching how to teach geoscience more effectively. And then from there, I became an Einstein Fellow at the National Science Foundation, so brought me back to Washington, D.C., where I was in the Office of Polar Programs. And from there, I was involved with the Joint Science Education Project, which brought together students from Greenland, Denmark, and the US onto the ice sheet to the different field stations to do independent collaborative research projects. And so I was really excited about that and wanted to continue doing that type of programming. And so that's when I decided to go back for my PhD. But then, what did I do my PhD in? Right? And so I found a program that blended both education and geology at North Carolina State. So my PhD is in marine, earth, and atmospheric sciences, and I did coursework in geosciences, but also educational psychology. And my dissertation work was focused on what I'm talking about today. So looking at self-regulated learning in a geoscience context. And then, doesn't end there. My winding path. Then after I graduated, I took a position as the assistant director at the Stern Center for Teaching and Learning at George Mason University. So while I was there, I was doing more of the faculty development, again, so teaching teachers how to teach, and then also teaching geology courses and doing my geoscience education research on the side. And I found I wanted to spend more time on that. And so when the position opened up at University of British Columbia, it was a bit of a unicorn position. So I was like, oh, I have to apply for this so I can pursue some of these lines of inquiry that I have. And so currently, I look broadly at student experiences in learning and the choices people make about their learning. But I also do work around systems change. And so I'm the lead on the Earth Science Experiential and Indigenous Learning Project at UBC. And so it's reimagining field-based learning through a lens of accessibility, inclusion, and incorporating Indigenous perspectives and working in partnership with communities around field courses. So if you want to talk about any of those things, or later after the talk, if any of the students want to talk about career paths and choices, happy to answer any questions about that. Now, you may be wondering, when is she going to talk about the stuff that we're here to learn about? Why did I spend all that time explaining that, my journey, how I got here? It's important to think about contextualizing what I'm going to be talking about, right? Because that informs my perspective and my interpretations of the data sets that I'm talking about. It's informing where I'm coming from in terms of theories of learning and more traditionally Western approaches and models of learning. So it's something to keep in mind as I'm talking about self-regulated learning today that's coming rooted from psychology, which is rooted in, if we go way back, behavioralist thinking and models of cognition. And so we'll kind of come back to that a little bit later. Okay, more to the heart of what you wanted to hear about today. So thinking about exam time. You know, you can think, if you're a student, think about yourself as exams come around. You're in these classes and you're like, what do I need to study? What do I need to do to prepare for this exam? If you're an instructor, thinking about, you probably get an inbox full of emails asking these questions about what should I study? How should I study for the exam? or after class or in office hours. And so taking that time to think about, what is somebody asking when they ask these questions? And so before we talk about unpacking what people are really asking when they ask these questions, some theoretical frameworks to consider as we think about this. So when we're designing a course, you can think about, how many people by a show of hands have heard the phrase designing with the end in mind, or backwards design? Okay, about half. Okay, it's this idea that there's intentionality to your teaching and your planning, right? That you're designing a course that by the end of my course, students will be able to do X, Y, Z. Students will know A, B, C. And so the idea is you're starting with that aim in mind, so these learning objectives, and then from those learning objectives, you intentionally decide on, okay, I want them to be able to do these things. How am I going to assess them on that? How will I evaluate whether they learn that knowledge or they have developed those skills? And then once you've figured that part out, then you intentionally say, okay, well, how do I get them to this point, right? So what are those learning support activities that I'm gonna have them do to practice, those opportunities to practice before they get assessed on that? And what are those resources and experiences that they'll have that will facilitate that learning process? So, and sometimes you'll hear this as the framework of course design. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to designing with the end in mind, backwards design, but they all are built around these frameworks, that there's an intentionality and there's an alignment behind our courses. Now for the students in the crowd, maybe you don't agree with, maybe that doesn't play out sometimes in our courses. I know I've had courses as a student where it's like, I'm not sure there was much alignment here, or necessarily this question of what do I want my students to learn? Again, I was a faculty developer for 7 years, and I would say this was often the question that would stop some instructors cold. When they came to think about like, well, I want to redesign my course. Oh, what do you want your students to do? What do you want them to be able to do by the end? And it was, oh, I don't know. And then really rethinking what that is. Sorry for the online folks if you can't see that. But back to our scenario, so connecting this to a scenario, right, of exams. So as instructors, right, if you have this intentional design to your course, you can point students to, oh, well, the learning objectives we talked about. So at the beginning of each class, I say, these are the 3 things you'll be able to do by the end of this class, or this lab activity. You can point them to those practice activities. You've probably built in some formative assessments, so it's directing that. So that design can become that structure that you support student learning with. Now, when we kind of step back and think broader models of student learning, we think, okay, we want those learner outcomes. What will people be able to do or know by the end of it? So usually measuring performance, so thinking about like grades, or in this case, exams. And then we think about, okay, we've got learners coming in with different lived experiences, prior knowledge that have brought them to this particular class in this point in time and space. And then as an instructor, I'm trying to create a certain learning experience. So this is where that design piece framework we were just talking about. And so oftentimes we think of it of, if I design the course, this will magically happen, right? We'll get these outcomes that students will come in, experience it, and then learning magically happens, right? But what's happening in that middle part? And so looking at some of Pintridge, Zimmerman models around this is thinking about what's going on with the learner during these experiences. So what's mediating those outcomes are these 2 general frameworks or processes. So thinking about motivational processes, and think about your own self through this, think about how motivated you are to engage in different things, aspects of your own personal goals. You know, if you're aiming for intrinsic purposes, like I really want to learn this and understand it and be able to explain this to people, it's very different than I need to make sure I get a certain grade point average so that I can keep my scholarship. That may be a different motivation that's driving your engagement with content. Think about other things, this term self-efficacy. By show of hands, how many people have heard of this? Okay, wow, that's great. Yeah, so if you're not familiar with that, think about feelings of self-confidence or competence around a particular topic. And then emotion can play a role in motivation as well. And then what I'm going to be focusing on more today is thinking about self-regulatory processes. So how do we manage our learning that we're doing? So what is the strategic piece of it? So again, this is the part of this diagram that I'm going to be talking about and kind of getting in the weeds a little bit about what are these different pieces of how we manage our learning. So this model is, I'm going to represent it as a cycle, and that's typically how it's presented, but it doesn't necessarily have to go in those steps. So I'll just put that little disclaimer out there. But in general, it's usually presented with planning. So this, again, intentionality around what you're doing. So setting goals. So in the case of an exam, okay, I want to do well on this exam. I want to get a certain performance on it. And so you're making an active decision, and then you're also deciding, okay, what is the task that is the exam? What do I need to be able to do on that exam in order to get that grade that I want to get? And then from there, deciding, okay, what are the strategies I'm going to use to learn that content or review that content? And then that transfers into the action phase where you actually do whatever your plan was. So actually, how much time do we have? Take a moment, turn to your neighbor. You're going to turn to your neighbor and tell them, how do you typically study for an exam? Or if you're an instructor, when you were a student. And if you're online, think to yourself, how do you typically study for an exam? Okay, come on back. Hopefully you had a chance to share some ideas about how you've studied for exams in the, studied for exams in the past, but basically what you were sharing with each other is that action piece, right? Like, what do you actually do? What does that look like in practice when you're studying for an exam? And so with the self-regulated model, there's this other piece to it, which is reflecting on that process. So if you've heard that term metacognition, right? Thinking about your thinking. So in this case of, as you're studying, are you thinking about how effective it is that you're studying and learning and assessing your learning whether you are or not as you're studying? And so this can be broken into things like monitoring, so keeping track of your thoughts and your feelings. And so if you think about that, like, right, studying can be very visceral sometimes. You're like, I'm not figuring this out, this makes no sense. Or it could be like, I'm so tired, I can't think about this anymore. Or it can be positive, like, yes, I finally got that one, when you're quizzing yourself or something. Or it could be more evaluation, so comparing your results. So again, that kind of checking yourself to see if you're right or not. And then analysis, deciding if that approach that you're using. So if you don't show your hands, but just think to yourself, like, did you talk about rereading your notes? Did you talk about creating a study guide? Did you talk about explaining to a friend or a colleague? Did you talk about flashcards? Did you talk about quizzing yourself? So think about those kinds of things. It's analyzing like, okay, did I actually learn that through my studying, and do I need to do something else? And oops, sorry. And that's where the regulation piece of self-regulated learning comes from. This is more that control piece of saying, okay, I've been studying this for an hour and I still don't get it. Something's not working here. I need to do something different to be prepared for that exam. And so that's the regulation part. So it's kind of going back to that drawing board maybe and saying, I need a different technique to learn this material. Maybe I'm going to do a concept map this time. Or it could be reinforcing yourself, like, yeah, okay. Having my friend quiz me on this worked. I seem to be learning it, so I'm going to keep going with it, just maybe another hour or something like that. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean you're changing what you're doing. It's just checking in with yourself and saying, yeah, it's working. Okay, so one of these strategies, so you just shared amongst yourselves different strategies. So there can be cognitive strategies. So cognition, thinking, the actual information processing piece. So how you organize information. So this could be rehearsal strategies. That would be like the rereading your notes kind of thing. Elaboration, that's like explaining to somebody else. That would be an example of that. Organization could be one, so like concept mapping. Or it could be metacognitive strategies. So again, thinking about your thinking. So how you're monitoring and controlling your application of these strategies. So again, well, I'll come back to that. It kind of links a lot of times to resource management strategies. So your control of internal things like attention and effort and motivation, like keeping yourself focused, like, oh, my to-do list is kind of coming in here, like, oh, I need to do this, but oh no, I gotta keep reading this, or I need to keep quizzing myself. Or it could be external things, so thinking about environment. So I'll be talking about, I interviewed 73 students as part of this project. So some people were like, I have to have a very quiet environment so I can really focus. Other people are like, I need to have music and and have that kind of like white noise going on so I can focus, right? So environmental control, or it could be, a lot of people talked about incentives, like if I study for this particular class for 2 hours, then I get to have a coffee, or I get to go for a walk, or something like that to motivate themselves to do things. So like I said, from my research, I was looking at intro geoscience courses at several different institutions, so community colleges, also research intensive institutions, 7 different instructors across this data set, 73 student interviews. And so the key question of the interview was, tell me how you studied for an exam. You have an exam coming up, so just what you answered. And then part of what I was doing was mapping out this process and kind of creating maps for each person of like what they're doing, what their choices were. And I asked some other questions around motivation and things like this. So what I'm sharing today is just a tip of the iceberg of some of this data, but it gives you a sense of looking across this, high performers, right? So in what I've just shared with you so far, we think, okay, what's that self-regulation process before our exam? How do people reflect after the exam, right? You walk out that door, you just took the exam. You're either like, yeah, oh, I think I did well, or you're like, oh, I missed number 7, it sticks with you. And how will that impact your future work? That's kind of how we framed it so far, but what emerged from the data was thinking about high performers and what they're doing strategically. So high performers, a couple different things. So they were very much doing self-regulated learning. I could map this through what they were sharing with me in their individual class activities. So all the homework assignments, the lab activities, they were doing a self-regulated cycle for each of those things and connecting that to their studying. So they were seeing the connection across that intentional design of the course and taking all those pieces and bringing it together. Whereas the lower performers oftentimes weren't even talking about the homeworks or the class assignments. They were seeing them as being disconnected oftentimes from the exam itself. And so oftentimes it would default to, I'm gonna just reread through all the notes instead of being strategic about what they're learning. They were also more effective at defining what the learning task was. So figuring out what is actually going to be on the exam, what do I need to be able to do for the exam? So they articulated a clear sense of that, and that was part of their strategy for what they were studying. Whereas lower performers, again, tended not to identify those things and just say, I'm going to study everything that the instructor said to me through the whole term. And then use more successful strategies. So we talked about a lot of different strategies already, but thinking about like reorganizing information, that elaboration retrieval process of having someone quiz you, that's more effective than rereading your notes, for example. And then they were doing more reflection and monitoring. So they were kind of checking themselves to say, oh, okay, I learned, modules 1, 2, and 3, but module 4 I'm still not getting. I'm not going to look at anything else about modules 1 through 3. I'm just going to focus on module 4. So they were being very strategic about where they were missing things. And then they tended to just be more effective at regulation in terms of some of those other strategies, using incentives or motivating themselves emotionally through their work. Okay, so that's more the theory and the research part. Getting back to the questions, right? As instructors, I have my students, we're in exam time right now, so I have students, I teach a disasters class, and I teach with other instructors, and so I teach the module on impacts and mass extinction events. And so the students, I'm starting to get emails about that, and so it's these questions of what should I study? How should I study for the exam coming up? And so what are we really asking, or what are students really asking when they ask these things? If we consider these questions in this lens of self-regulated learning, right, it could be an issue of planning, right? It could be this question of, when you say, what do I need to study? It could really be saying, what is the task that I'm supposed to be doing? What is the exam actually going to be? So maybe they're having challenges around identifying what the task actually is. So that intentional design around, you should be able to do X, Y, Z, maybe they've missed that part and they're not clear on it. It could also be, they've done a task analysis. They're like, I think these 5 topics are going to be on the exam, but I'm not quite sure. You're the person who made the exam. I'm going to ask you and compare what I think to what you think is going to be on the exam. And then in that sense, being strategic about what is going on there. So they're adding this evaluation piece onto it. So they're comparing their analysis of the task to your analysis of the task. And so in that sense, they're trying to become more expert in terms of that exam preparation. And then it could also be this issue of what we were describing earlier. I've been studying a certain way my whole life, and it's worked out great. Here I am, I'm at university, I'm in this class, but it's not working right now. Right? Like for this exam, maybe I didn't do as well in my last exam. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I got to do something different, but I don't know what, right? Because I've been doing this one strategy the whole time and it's been fine. And so it could be this issue of figuring out and sharing strategies of what could be alternative strategies. So really asking this question of how do people learn? If it's not the way that I've been doing this whole time, what are some other ways people learn information? Or it could be kind of zooming out, it could be more around these issues of motivational processes. So it could be actually emerging concerns around competency. So maybe not feeling competent or confident in their skill set, or it could be anxiety or other emotions that are fueling those questions that are influencing their processes. So thinking about, I use the example around concerns around financial aid, for example, particularly when I taught community college. This was a common anxiety that was coming into the conversation around exam preparation because there was this added layer of my ability to pay my bills tied to how I perform on this exam is a very stressful situation, right, to be in. And so it was impacting how they were regulating in making those choices, and in some cases also undermining their confidence about their abilities. And then it could also be, in some cases, I don't care enough about this course. It's, you know, a required course for a different major. Can you just like shortcut it for me and just tell me what I need to study? So that case came up as well. And I hear some giggles in the crowd, like that may have been a situation if you had a required course that you weren't as concerned about. So the question is, okay, we've talked about these regulation skills. Can this be taught? Can it be learned? And the answer is a resounding yes. There was a fantastic study recently that was a meta-analysis of many different studies around self-regulated learning. And so in terms of context, thinking about days or weeks of explicitly training students about these different strategies. And so key takeaways, feedback was critical. So that timeliness from both peers and instructors was important in terms of people learning to regulate. And if you think about that, that's really supporting that reflection part of it, right? Helping people identify what's working and what's not working. Also, cooperative learning arrangements, which makes sense, ties into the feedback. You're getting real-time feedback. And I'll say also in my courses, we use two-stage exams. So for example, so that for the students in the crowd, you would take your exam individually and then collect all of those. And then you would take the same exam with a group. And so it's that idea that you know, just when you finish an exam, you know, like, oh, question 7 and question 8, but you get to talk with people right away about it. So you get that quick feedback, you get a better sense in deeper learning with it. And then also learning protocols. So supporting efficient resource management. What I mean by learning protocols, that could be those structures built into the course that are that intentional design piece. And then also explicit self-regulated learning trainings around thinking about motivation and self-efficacy. So across these different studies, they found too that older and non-traditional students were finding more benefit from these efforts. Now, on the more practical, okay, great, there's this article, you could read about all these different studies. But on the short term, what can I do today, right? As you think about, you're starting off your quarter here, as you start getting into exams, how can we prepare our students, or as a student, how can you prepare yourself? Thinking about supporting these, you know, in a large classroom like this, if you have this many students, how can you do these things at scale? So if you're an instructor in the crowd, you're probably doing a lot of these things already, right? So having those clear learning objectives, the assessments linked to the learning objectives like we talked about, having regular assignments with feedback. So again, getting that feedback to internalize. The map of connections, this is often the piece that's maybe missing sometimes from conversations, is that map of connections between all those pieces. Okay, do you have the learning objectives connected to different slides, for example, or to different activities that are reinforcing the concepts? So if someone's having trouble in one particular area, they know what resources to connect back to. And then also thinking about opportunities for explicit reflection on learning processes. So these could be things like learning logs, which is where you write about how you think you're learning and how that's going. These could be pre or post assessments. And we'll talk about exam wrappers in a moment. And then also explicit directions around strategies. So sharing a list of different strategies people use to learn. So kind of, how do we do this at scale? I'm going to focus a little bit on this reflection piece, because oftentimes if people aren't engaging in this process, it's usually this step that's not happening. And so how can we support this at scale in large classes? And exam wrappers are one way to do this. And so in the simple version, it's having some kind of pre-reflection before an exam, and then importantly, a post-reflection And so students are engaging and thinking about that learning process through the whole experience of the exam. And so these could be things where it's more checklist-like items, like what are the strategies you're using, to asking them to reflect on task analysis part. So it's not just what do I study, how do I study, it's thinking about asking your students how do you decide what to study is a good question to ask, not just how are you studying for an exam. And we'll come back to that in a second. It could be questions around rating your confidence. Here are our list of learning objectives. Rate your level of confidence or understanding of these different topics. And that's a way to kind of segue into priming what that task analysis is. And I'll just go back for a second. So this is coming from other research that I did with some students in terms of using exam wrappers across different courses. And student feedback on it has always been positive. So, but then also it's the emails, the office hours, right? Students coming in sometimes that moment of crisis of like, how do I prepare for this exam? What do I need to do? So again, it's thinking about asking them what they typically do, so kind of what we did earlier, but asking that second question, how do you decide what to study? And so asking those two questions, I personally find is very revealing. So pretty quickly you'll know kind of like, okay, is this a task analysis issue? Is it a how do people learn issue? Or is it something else going on? And then I won't read you this list, but I'll share this slide with you so that you have them. But thinking about asking them things around time, how much time do you think you'll spend on this task? When are you studying? I will say for the many years I've collected data on this, and everybody knows this, we work towards deadlines. Most people are studying 2 to 1 day before the exam. And so thinking about, is that realistic with the strategies you're using? Or is it something that maybe you still wait till that time, but maybe 2 weeks before you've done kind of some self-evaluation to decide what you need to study. So you're not studying all the things, just the things that you're having trouble with. And then thinking about with timeline, is it just you need time to do the strategies, or is it that you actually need help understanding the concepts? And if you need help with the concepts, who or what are those resources that are going to help you with that, and how much time do you need to meet with people or read those resources? So basically the short version of that is you're trying to help that reflection process to complete a self-regulated learning cycle. Because what we're seeing is with low performers, they're not completing that cycle. And so the even bigger picture is transparency. It really comes down to a lot of transparency about your course design if you're an instructor. So making your pedagogy obvious, your expectations obvious, and the path to success obvious, right? What is it that you want your students to be able to do on this exam or other assessment form you're taking? And then what is it they need to do in order to get there? And so, and being clear about, here are the little markers along the way and the checkpoints of how to get there. And so that's the information I have to share. I'm happy to talk about other areas, but if we have time, I thought it'd be great, again, to talk in groups about how, if you're a student, how do you kind of navigate this, or as instructors, how do we support students? But I don't know, time-wise, do we have time? Okay. Okay. So take a few moments, turn to your group. Oh, thank you. Well, I'll ask the question, do we want to do that, or do we want to do Q&A?
Your choice.
How many people want to just do Q&A? Okay, no
Looks like it's the other one.
Okay, okay. So talk with some folks around you. We'll come back and do some Q&A after you chat about how do you support students in task analysis, learning strategies, self-evaluation, discuss, and then we'll share out.
Hannah has been doing a very good job recently with making like the slides. We'll do like a slide at the end of each class of like the main points we talked about, and then before the exam, she'll take all of the main points on the slide and make a study guide out of that. And so, and the students make the slide based off of their notes that they took during the class. So you know that, oh, this study or this exam is going to be based off of my notes that I took during the class.
Which professor is doing that?
Hannah Shamlin, Dr. Hannah Shamlin.
She's doing a good job,
right?
you say?
She's doing an amazing job.
And I was in a sorority.
It's Volcanology 478. Very great class.
Excellent.
Organic.
It's pretty awesome.
Right. It just,
You
they
say
made
comments on
things
this topic.
times, and I was so undisciplined. But when I went back
I don't know.
as a
I think
four-year-old,
a lot of
it
the
was more,
professors within this
what do you
department
do
are actively
if you
trying
can't
to
understand something,
teach
just put
better.
more time
And
into
I
it,
think in every
you can
class
figure
I've
it out.
taken
But
in the
inorganic
department,
chemistry was like,
in some way, in one way or another,
Yeah,
the
that's not gonna
professors
help you on
are
that
trying
one.
to improve their teaching
Really?
style. So they're asking questions of like, what can I do better? What can I not? What should I not do?
it was just a
I think
concept that I had to get through because I wanted
it's
to
a nice
get
environment to
organic.
be in.
Well, that's a really interesting
Yeah, there was an issue
answer.
with that.
I
So
didn't
this
know
is
that was
very interesting.
happening.
I'm
Like it's
working
more
on
than
being
just Hannah and Jordan, and some of the older
But
professors as well.
Both Bree and Chris. I mean, I've taken more classes with them than anybody else. But yeah, Bree and Chris, I think both do a good job. I've taken one class with
Okay,
Susan.
those concept maps.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, and literally
With the short time
maps
I've had
because it's
in her
geology.
class, I think she's also doing the same. She's
And
trying to
he knows
figure
what
out,
he's talking about that
because she
way.
was
So
on sabbatical
I've
last year, so
always
she's just
as
trying to work out the kinks, because
geology and
before that it was COVID,
way.
so the teaching style was a little different,
Because
but
it's
I think
fun.
she's improving on that.
I'm taking his
I've
techniques
had
that
a
I
few
see
classes
what
with
he's
Carrie
done
and Lisa,
now
but
to be able
not
to
enough to
understand the
really.
concepts better.
Oh, nice.
So
But it feels
he's been
genuine.
very
It doesn't feel like
Yeah.
they're just asking, how can I improve,
you
without
have
really.
a tremendous background.
Yeah, because they actually make changes. Like
It's a long and winding
it's all
path,
throughout
yeah.
the quarter, not just like at the end.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
Bree was asking
Oh,
midway
and did.
through the quarter, I think.
Yeah, and
I don't remember specifics, but I remember her making
yes,
specific
through
changes.
NHGT,
And
yep.
Chris was also making specific changes during mineralogy.
Oh, great, great. I'm gonna wander around.
I know for a fact that Bree did a self-evaluation at the end of every sedimentology class. She would
what are
basically
you
give
thinking?
you an
What are-
exam,
what
but
are
it
your
wasn't
strategies?
graded. It was for her to understand how well she taught you the different topics and what she can do to improve the next time she teaches the class. And so I think a lot of professors are very great professors, first of all, but also like working to better themselves every quarter.
And that's not every department either. I think in this department in particular, we're pretty blessed to have the professors we have. In my other gen eds and other non-gen eds, but I just took the class for fun, they're not necessarily trying to actively be a better teacher. They're just teaching for the sake of teaching. So I think I've said it before, not directly to you, but I think this department is great. In that sense.
I'm very surprised by your that commentary, to be honest. Like, I know we have a good program, but I didn't know it was quite like that with so many of our professors. I can talk to my history. I never had a professor ever ask me how they were doing and how they can change what they're doing. So that's cool that that culture is there.
I think it is very cool.
Yeah, some of my other work is looking at professional identity development in
Oh,
field
yeah.
I didn't
experience.
know we were trying
So
to.
that's more that sociology piece of looking at how
Oh, yeah.
how do people
No.
Well, good. Let's
develop
get names of
the social
professors who
identity
don't do
as a
that. And how
geologist,
terrible
and
the
how does
courses
that?
were.
Oh,
Say, let's go.
jeez.
Yeah, so
Oh,
how does that
gosh.
happen? Yeah.
We'll keep it anonymous.
What about you, Nick? What do you do for your students? I mean, obviously we know, but for the people at home.
Well, you weren't talking about me. You were both in my 101 class. I wasn't doing what you're talking
Oh, but
about.
you're an exception because you're already like absolutely fantastic at teaching, and I can't understate that enough. Like, my God, you got us both booked in literally a week. So I think that's
We
a
were
testament
taking
to
your class,
teaching
you
style.
went major, and we went,
Oh, yeah.
okay, fine.
Yeah, what's at the root of education?
There's not much else to say
but
about that.
Communicating
Like,
ideas
you
or not.
are
And
the
helping
magnet
people
of
communicate
this
their
program.
ideas
You're
back
what,
and to
like,
express
brings
their
people
learning.
into geology, which I think is
I think
pretty
you-
Okay,
pretty
I'm
special.
gonna keep
I think
wandering.
you have it very well figured because I don't think there was ever a time where I had to go back through my notes to try to figure out.
How's it going
something.
back here? Thoughts,
During
questions?
that lecture, I learned the stuff we were actually talking about, like actually learned it enough to the point
Oh.
where I didn't have to go back.
I think that your teaching style
yeah,
is
that
like
one is-
pretty unique as well. I don't think that a lot of professors can do what you do because of the way that you are so interactive in your class and you draw these diagrams yourself in real time.
Okay,
so
yeah,
that the
so
students
using
can
those
draw along
strategies.
with
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
And I actually disagree with what you said. I think you did do that because I took your 101 class and then your 351 class, and between those classes, you did, do your best, and I think you actually did like better yourself to make sure that you went into depth on some topics and you took
I
feedback
love it,
from your
yeah.
101 classes.
Yeah,
and applied it
ideally
to your
we're moving away from
351.
exams,
And
but
I think both of those classes were amazing, but like I did notice that you are always trying to do better as well. So
Most professors don't drag themselves across a table to do glacial striations.
Yeah.
so-
You did like that one. I do remember that one.
and the big hunk bars. We can't forget the big hunk bars.
What is your plan for the future? You are graduating soon.
We both fall.
You both fall, so it's Christmas time, and we're celebrating.
I know it's. I find that very
birth-
helpful too. That visualization question.
What-
Yeah, and again, it's that transparency of like
I can
really
improve myself.
articulating what that idea is.
What is the plan? Will you be applying to graduate school? Both of you guys are extremely bright. Have you been encouraged by the people here to pursue more school?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been encouraged to pursue graduate school, and I may, but I'm probably going to end up taking a gap year of some kind so that I can get some field experience and know what I'm doing if I were to do that.
We're
It's-
both going to get our GIT.
Yeah, and
Together.
yeah, it's something that
Yeah.
What's that?
as
It's
instructors,
the geology and
most
training
cases people
license.
aren't trained in
So it's the
how to
ASBOG
teach,
exam.
and then they find themselves
We're going to
teaching.
apply for that over the summer
Yeah.
and then study for it in the fall and then take it in the fall together. For the future, something with exploration geology, maybe structural. It seems like the most viable route for me. It's what I'm best at, I would say.
I'm gonna keep that visual with me. I'm gonna keep wondering.
But you're both kind of
Thank you.
resistant to diving into grad school right away. Is that what I'm feeling and hearing from
Oh
you
my
guys?
gosh! Oh my gosh! We were talking about so many
you
other
burned
things.
out?
Yeah, I totally forgot. Maybe have a couple more.
I'm
stuff
definitely
for us, or-
resistant because I think, one, I'm a little bit tired of school at this point. Like, I
Okay.
kind of
Okay.
want
Yeah, I
to
totally forgot. Thank you for reminding
do
me.
something else.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I also have some
Yeah,
external
I'm so sorry. I was like,
um,
well, it's funny when we were talking earlier too. Like I was
aspects
like,
to my
"There's something I
life
was
that
gonna
make
ask
me
you about,"
want
and then we
to
were
be
talking about
closer to
other
home,
things,
like
and then we ran
my
out of time. So
significant
I was like,
other,
oh, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Being away,
Thank
you know,
you.
at school for another 2 years
yeah.
sounds like a lot of work and kind of a
Oh
challenge.
yeah, yeah.
So
Okay, yeah.
we'll
Let's
see how
follow
it
up
goes.
about that.
Thank you. You say?
I think I'll try to fit in a couple more.
Flip-flopping
If
between
people have questions. Okay.
scone.
Okay, come
Going
on
to grad
back.
school,
Come on
not going to
back.
grad school. I think I've had some self-doubt recently just about.
Okay, hopefully you had a delightful
Probably
conversation with your friends and colleagues there about different strategies, or hopefully, or some takeaway. So hopefully you leave my talk today with some takeaway for yourself in terms of how you process things and learn things. It doesn't have to be in an exam format, right? So thinking about learning something new. For example, since moving to Vancouver, I'm learning to sail, and that is way out of my scope of life experiences. And so it's like puts me back in that remembering what it's like to learn something completely new with all sorts of terminology that make no sense to me. And to remember thinking about that learning process and scaffolding myself and reminding myself of these learning models of how we learn. Or if you're an instructor, hopefully you're taking away, or congratulating yourself, patting yourself on the back for things that you're doing already in your class, or thinking maybe new things that you want to try, or being, if you don't have students coming asking these questions, they probably still have these questions even if they're not asking you. So thinking about maybe proactively asking them. If you find a student who's maybe not doing as well, reaching out and not asking about the grade, but it's asking like, hey, I just want to chat how things are going in the class. Tell me about how you study for the upcoming exam. What are you thinking? It could be a way to start a conversation as well. So I think we have a couple minutes. I want to make sure there was time if people did have questions, that we had time to answer any questions.
Yeah, let's do a few questions, and if you wouldn't mind repeating the questions so the
right.
home people
Sure.
can hear the questions as well. Are there questions for Laura, please?
Who's brave and bold? Okay, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So I have a question about motivation for students that ask, they're saying, I'm having trouble motivating myself to study. Is there anything, this might be too broad, anything that you suggest outside of incentives?
Oh, yeah. So there's also research in terms of research around having students think about their values. So the research has been like having students think about their values at the beginning of a course and how that can support other things around identity and feelings of competence. But it's also been linked to thinking about motivation, because it's reminding yourself about your intrinsic motivation and why you're doing what you're doing, why you're here, like what is it that you want to do with this, and how is learning this going to inform your choices that will have more of that personal motivation. And that reminder around those values can help as well. And I will say from the research, because like I said, that was the tip of the iceberg of that data, I did look at motivation as part of this thread. And so all of the respondents talked about extrinsic motivations, so thinking more of that incentive level, but it was the high performers that were also talking about intrinsic motivations as well. And so, but reminding people about those links, because sometimes you get, stressed out by the day-to-day and people forget the bigger picture of why they're doing. So that can be a helpful way. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Anne.
I wonder if you have seen or experienced differences. You talked mostly about intro level. As you go into upper level courses or even into the graduate level, do you see differences in that self-regulated learning cycle or in the strategies that are more effective or needed?
Oh, good question. I realized I didn't repeat the question,
It's
so
okay.
apologies to those online. So the question was, I was talking mostly and presenting data about intro level courses. Is there data about self-regulated learning cycles at advanced levels and thinking about other contexts? And that's one of the things I'm interested in now. One of the areas I'm studying is looking at regulation in field settings, but then also thinking about experts. And so thinking about people that are employed as geologists. That's something it's kind of the next kind of round of things I want to do, is looking, because I'm also looking at professional identity development. So how do people, at what point do people feel like a geologist or a geological engineer, and what's the role of field courses in that, but also this idea of how do people learn on site? Because oftentimes from some of my initial interviews, the academic field courses aren't mapping to the field experiences that they're doing in industry in this particular case. And so it's relearning, right? Like it's learning new skills in a field setting, hopefully building off of the academic skills. But so it's going to be these questions around that. In terms of research that's out there, I'm not as familiar because most of the research has focused more at the intro level or psychology students, convenient population, in terms of how they're learning in post-secondary settings. So it hasn't really looked at that kind of scale, but it's an open question, and I think it's an interesting one. So, yeah.
I was wondering about your ideas or research on the specific utility or benefits of exams versus other types of assessments.
Yes. So the question was my perspective on the benefit or the exams versus other types of assessment. Yes, I was talking with a group in the back. Yeah, hopefully we're moving away from exams and thinking about more portfolio-based or experiential learning. In some cases, I know some folks here are working on ungrading and thinking about what that looks like. Yeah, in terms of, at the end of the day, it comes down to design and what are you trying to assess, right? And does that assessment actually match with what you're trying to, what your learning objectives are? So if you want students to leave with communication skills, conceptual knowledge, X, Y, Z, like, is a multiple choice exam actually assessing that or not? And I would argue in many cases you're not assessing half of those learning objectives that you have. If you have those objectives around communication skills or collaborative science skills, which is very huge and important in doing science these days. Most science is collaborative. So you're not assessing that through an exam. So there's lots of research out there about portfolio-based learning, which is the common model with ungrading. Yeah.
One more?
Yeah. Yes.
Would you be willing to speak a little bit about the importance of self-regulation and emotional aspects, whether somebody is on heightened alert, they're very comfortable, whatever those pieces might be? I think that would be very helpful, one, for students to recognize that this aspect, the emotional component, helps us not only for retention and performance, but anxiety, and likewise for instructors to map out some time within the classroom for this type of self-regulation. It's so important that you should take up precious lecture time. Could you please speak to whatever you wish?
Okay. Yeah, so trying to repeat that question. So the question was around emotion, the role of emotion in learning, and thinking about regulating emotion. And so there is a lot of research around emotion regulation, also in the context of learning. And I will say, again, my long-winded story at the beginning about my journey and how I got here. So in where I'm rooted from an educational psychology perspective, a lot of these cognitive-based models are coming from psychology where those initial theoretical frameworks were this kind of split between cognition and what they called affect. And so things like emotion, self-efficacy, et cetera. But with the development of new data, right? As science, as we get new data, we change our thinking about things. Through the new data that has emerged through neuroscience, we can actually see the physics and the chemistry of how these things are actually interlinked. You can't actually separate cognition and affect, so that emotional piece specifically, and how people are defining emotions. And so, yes, we can't really talk about just a cognitive model of it. It is all connected. And so in terms of, there are all sorts of research around the strategies people use to regulate emotions. And I will say from my particular work, that was something that came out that, interestingly, the high performers, and this, again, it's just a small population here, data set, but the high performers were actually leveraging negative emotions and using that as a motivation tool. And so, which, is problematic, right? I'm not saying we should do that. I'm just saying in that particular case, that's what they were doing to drive their performance. But there were folks that were also identifying positive emotions. So thinking about interest and feeling happy and joy around engaging in the work. They were also using that to drive their emotions. So, and if you think about incentives, a lot of that is trying to evoke that. So you're trying to evoke some positive emotions, thinking like future looking, like, okay, if I do this thing that I don't want to do, if I get this reward at the end, I will have this joy and happiness. And so there is that emotional piece to that, and that is part of how people are regulating, using emotions to regulate behaviors. So, yeah.
Let's thank Laura for her presentation today. Thanks, everybody.
You.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Yeah, you bet. I'm sure there'll be a few folks coming up to visit with you afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura.
My legs don't get
Can I go up and ask her questions?
Please do, yeah.
my legs are cold and noon. It's only my upper body that gets cold. It's kind of weird. I don't know.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. If you joined us late, that was a science education talk by Laura Lukes from the University of British Columbia. And for a very different type of a talk, a week from today, Friday, April 26th, Carl Lilquist from the the Geography Department right here at CWU will give a talk on rock glaciers, permafrost, and other cold climate phenomenon in Washington's Eastern Cascades. And then there'll be two more talks in May, one on ice cores in the Italian Alps and another about tsunami in the Salish Sea, up Vancouver way, Vancouver, BC. So thanks so much for joining us today. We'll look for you again next time. I love you, thank you, and goodbye. Goodbye from Ellensburg, Washington, USA.